But as Pastor Christian said, this is something I was really excited about to preach about. A couple of my favorite verses, and well, I always say that every time I preach, these are my favorite verses. But I choose verses that really, when I have, look, we're not in a series, and Pastor Allen says, choose whatever you want. I really pray about it, and I get excited, and it usually comes to some of my favorite verses. If you always see me up here saying, these are some of my favorite verses, as Pastor Allen gave me a green light to preach on these. And these are two of very important verses in my life and my growth as a Christian, and it's because it gives us, as Pastor Christian said, a glimpse of God's sovereignty, of who He is, how He's in control of His character. And the problem is it comes at the end of a story, a huge story in the Bible, and it's like the very end. It's like watching the last few minutes of a movie. And like it'd be like me getting up here and trying to talk to you guys about, have you seen this movie? Let me tell you about the last few minutes of it. Because that's what's happening here. So I wanted to break these verses down. It's Genesis 50, 19, and 20. It says this, But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So I wanted to break these verses down, but I kind of have to give you context. I can't start at the end of a story and just say, okay, this is what these verses mean. We have to look at what happened, what went into it, and into this story there is a lot of background. And I kept having to go back. I'm like, I'll go back a couple verses and do context. And then I was like, well, they're not going to understand that if I don't. And I had to go back further and further and further. And I kept going back. And it was like, I don't know if you guys ever had like a sweater and there's a little string hanging off, and you're like, oh, let me just get this. And then you're just like, what in the world, and it just keeps pulling, and then pretty soon one of your sleeves is shorter than the other. That's what I felt like as I kept pulling on it, and it was like 8 pages of context, and I'm like, so I had to just cut it off and go back, because what really, even before Joseph, this is about Joseph, and even before Joseph is born, the family dynamics went into everything that's going to happen. Actually, what I did is I cut the sermon in half a little bit, and then I taught it in Sunday school this morning with the youth, leading up, some of the context, leading up to Joseph's life. But today here from the pulpit, we're going to be talking about not what led up to Joseph's life and why his father had this love for him, or why all these things happened and the sin that went around his family. But we're just going to start with Joseph's life. If you want to read more background than that, you can go back even farther. But we're still going back pretty far to go to the start of Joseph's life, because when he says this at verse 19, he's around 41 years old. So we're going to go back pretty far and go back to Genesis chapter 37. So if you have your Bible, if you turn to start with in Genesis chapter 27, we're going to go back to the beginning of Joseph's life, or at least near the beginning, and where Joseph's problems start with his brothers. Why they hated him. Joseph, in verse 3 of chapter 37, Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than all of his brothers. So they hated him and couldn't speak to him on friendly terms. They hated him and couldn't speak to him on friendly terms. There's people that I've disagreed with over the years. There's some even, I don't know, maybe you guys have people in your life that sometimes they rub you the wrong way, and you're like, that guy rubs me the wrong way. I wouldn't have a barbecue with him, but, when I see him, I can say, hey, how's it going? How's the family? How's your mom and him? I can talk to him, but I can't. Joseph, it wasn't even like that. They couldn't even say a kind thing to Joseph. They couldn't even speak on friendly terms with him. That's how much his brothers hated him. Why? Why did they hate him this much? He had 11 brothers, by the way. Why did they hate him this much? Well, it says they saw their father loved him more than all of his brothers. They said, hey, I think Dad loves Joseph more. And they were jealous, and Joseph was the recipient of all their anger because of that. Something that he wasn't really in control of. And as a parent, we know as a parent, that you assure your kids, you say, hey, wait a minute. You think that I love them better because I took them out, but remember I took you out yesterday and we did something yesterday, or, you don't like fishing, that's why I took him fishing, and things like that. We assure our kids, hey, listen, I love you, I love you both the same, right? Or in Christian's case, I love all 8 of you the same. But don't put PowerPoint stuff. I'll come at you in my sermons. He photoshopped me slapping a rhino. But that's what you do. You assure. I assure my kids all the time. Listen, we love you the same. Anytime one gets something, the other doesn't. We say, no, wait a minute. I love you guys both the same. It just, next week you'll get to do this, or this, you'll have this opportunity. But his father, Jacob, didn't do that. He didn't say, you know what, guys, I love all my kids the same. He said, you know what, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a robe, a special robe, to set you apart from everybody else. A multicolored robe, a tunic. That when they look at you, in case they ever doubted that I love you more, they're going to look at you, and now they're going to say he definitely loves him more. That is not good parenting. That is the worst possible thing you can do. And Joseph faces the consequences of it. And the reason he loves Joseph more too is that goes back into the family dynamics, is he was playing favorites, with Joseph's mother anyway. But we're not going to get into all that today. But he makes huge mistakes here, and it throws his family into chaos. And to make matters worse, he uses Joseph to spy on his brothers. Right? He's like, listen, I want you to watch your brothers, and whenever they mess up or do something, I want you to come back and report that to me. I want you to give me reports of how because they were all working, and they're working the fields and things like that, and I want you to go out when they're shepherding, when they're doing things. I want you to go watch, and I want you to bring back these reports. And in verse 2 of chapter 37, it says, Joseph brought back a bad report about his brothers to their father. Okay, so now they're even madder. Okay, not only is he the favorite, now he's telling on us. He's going and bringing back bad reports to Dad, and now Dad likes him even more and us even less, which is not. I mean, when I was growing up in school, I don't know if they still say this. Some of you young people know. They say snitches get stitches, which means if you tell on me, I'm going to beat you up, right? That's what's. So you didn't. You were like, oh, I don't want to tell because it just angers. So here Joseph tells on his brothers. The favorite kid tells on his brothers, and they were really, really mad, and their anger just starts to go higher and higher and higher. And that's not even it. Joseph then started having these dreams where his brothers are seen bowing down to him. And Joseph's one of the younger brothers, and he sees his brothers bowing down to him. And so what does Joseph do? He tells them. Right? Like, Joe, you got to keep that to yourself, right? There's some things that you just, that's fine, you're having these dreams, but you got to keep this, but he doesn't. And so this makes it matters even worse. It says, verse 6, please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to them, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. You'd think that Joseph have a little common sense here. I don't know why he felt the need to tell his brother. The Bible doesn't say, a lot of people get up and say, he was very prideful. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't give us an insight into his actions. It doesn't say he was prideful or sinful in these, but I still have no idea why he felt the need to tell him these dreams. But whatever his motive was, it fueled the hatred even more. So you see it just beginning to rise and rise. And his brothers were getting more angry and more angry. So one day, Jacob the father used Joseph once again as his personal spy to go and check on his brothers. So they were in Dothan, about 63 miles away from where they lived. And Jacob sent Joseph over on this multi-day trip. And we pick up in verse 17 here. It says, so Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And when he saw them from a distance, before he came close to them, they plotted against him and put him to death. They want this. Okay, we're to the boiling point. They're like, hey, here he comes. Let's kill him. That's how much the hatred and anger rose. Let's put him to death. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben, the oldest, heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, let us not take his life. Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him. He said that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. When Joseph arrived, he reached his brothers. They stripped him of his robe, his tunic, the very colored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty without any water in it. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. He is our brother, our own flesh." The brothers listened to him, and some Midianite traders passed by, and they pulled up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So they were going to kill him, and they were like, let's kill him, and then they were like, let's make some money off of him. So they go to sell, and they sell him. They sell him to these Midianite traders, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. And they kill this goat, and they put blood all over this robe, this robe that set him apart. They use that to trick his father to say that he was dead. Okay, we didn't kill him, but we're done with him. And he's going to suffer. So that's where we're at right now. Joseph's father thinks he's dead, and Joseph has become a slave. Sold and sold again, and then sold again. Joseph, because of something that was out of his control, the sin and evil, and even the sin by his father, he finds himself as a slave. And we pick up the story in chapter 39. So we're moving along. You can see, don't get too worried that we started in chapter 37 and we got to go to 50. It jumps around a little bit. Chapter 39, Joseph's been taken to Egypt. In verse 1, he's taken to Egypt and he's sold to Potiphar. He's an Egyptian officer to Pharaoh. He's the captain of the bodyguard. So it's a very important position. And Joseph gets sold into his house, and now he's a slave for the house of Potiphar. And he could be sitting there. He did nothing wrong. He could say, man, I did nothing wrong. He could have this attitude, this hatred, this anger. But instead, he works hard for Potiphar. He works as unto the Lord. He does his best and respectfully works as hard as he can. And Potiphar finds out that Joseph is a very, very capable man. It says in verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of the master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. He made him overseer of his house and all that he owned and put him in his charge. It came about from that time he made him overseer in his house over all that he owned, and the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on the account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So God gives him success, and he works hard and respectfully, and he works, and God gives him success. And everything seems like it might start turning around, but then we find out that Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with Joseph. And Joseph refuses. So what does she do? She grabs onto Joseph. She grabs his tunic. And he flees. He just get away from her. He pulls out of it. He flees and he leaves it behind. And when her husband comes home, she claims that Joseph tried to sleep with her against her will, which is the exact opposite of what happened. And he's like, are you sure? And she pulls out the tunic and says, look, he left this here when he fled. Now, if I was Joseph at this point, robes or tunics got me in trouble twice. I would just go around without a shirt on because like twice these things got him in trouble, right? What happens? Potiphar is angry. He throws him into prison, unjustly put in captivity again. I'd be having enough of it at this point. All right, I didn't do anything wrong, and I got sold into slavery. Now I didn't do anything wrong. I did the right thing. I did the righteous. I did the just thing. I worked hard. I worked respectfully. And now I'm in prison. Right? What's going on here? But Joseph works hard and respectfully in prison. And the chief jailer puts in Joseph's charge all the prisoners. He said, you know what? I see what kind of man you are. I see what kind of capable man and honorable man you are. I'm going to put all the prisoners in your charge. So Joseph goes into prison as a prisoner. Now he's in prison, but he's in charge of all the prisoners who were in jail. And while he was in there, he met a cupbearer and a baker that were used to be the cupbearer and baker for the king, and they were both confined to jail. And on the same night, they had a dream. Each man had their own dream, and Joseph interprets them. The baker will be hanged, and the chief cupbearer will be restored to his office. So he tells them this, and in chapter 40, verse 14, he says to the cupbearer, "Keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and don't forget me here languishing in prison. Do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this place. For I was, in fact, kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing that they should have put me in this dungeon." So Joseph interprets a dream, and he says, listen, when you get restored to your position, you're going to be with Pharaoh, and tell him about me. Don't forget me. Remember me. Tell him about me. Tell him I've been falsely accused. Tell him I've been stolen and kidnapped and sold into slavery. And let him know. And in verse 23, it says this, "And the chief cupbearer didn't remember Joseph, but forgot him." Man, it just seems like this guy can't catch a break. Everything, he's trying to do the right thing, and everything he does, he tries to do faithfully. And every single time, it seems like it ends up terrible for him. He worked hard and respectfully for his father, and his brothers threw him down a pit and sold him as a slave. He worked hard and respectfully as a slave and was falsely accused and imprisoned. He worked hard and respectfully as a prisoner and was forgotten. It all started because his brothers betrayed him, and it ends with him sitting here in prison, forgotten. I don't know if you guys have ever felt betrayed and forgotten. Betrayed and forgotten by friends, relatives, loved ones. Betrayed and forgotten by everybody. But I can tell you, God didn't forget Joseph, and God doesn't forget us. He may have felt like he was forgotten, but he wasn't. God had a great plan for Joseph. God never forgets. What happens? Pharaoh has a dream. And he has a dream, and nobody can interpret it. And the cupbearer goes, "Wait a minute. That happened to me one time. And this guy in prison, he remembered Joseph, and he says Joseph interpreted the dream." So Pharaoh sends for him, and Joseph tells him the dream and interprets it. And the dream is this: you're going to have years of plenty, and then you're going to have years of famine. So Pharaoh tells Joseph, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to be in charge. Since God gave you this wisdom, God gave you this power, I want you to be in charge of storing up food and grain in the years of plenty, so that way when the famine hits, we will be prepared. We won't starve." So Joseph does. And Joseph does an amazing job of that. And Pharaoh doesn't just put Joseph in charge of collecting the food. Listen to this. He puts him in charge of everything. He says, "Since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and as wise as you are. You shall be over my house according to your command, and all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you." Only in the throne I'm greater than you. Joseph is in Egypt, the greatest power in that time in the world, and Joseph is the second in command in Egypt at this point. And sure enough, the famine hits. They had the years of plenty. Joseph stored up food, and then the famine hits. And people around start starving. But Egypt has food. Egypt has food. And areas are all being affected by famine, and people are being saved because they're coming to Egypt for food. And guess what? Joseph's family is being affected by the famine. They're starting to starve. In chapter 42, verse 2, look what it says here. Jacob says, "I heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there, buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die." They're going to die. There's no food left. They have nothing to eat. And Jacob, Joseph's father, says, Go down to Egypt and see if you can get some food from them so that we live and don't die. I don't know if you remember, this is vital that they live. This is God's chosen people. This is the line that Jesus Christ is going to come through. And Joseph is sitting in Egypt, and he sees his brothers come up. Sees that his brothers came to see if they could get food so they could live. And Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Because I want to put this in perspective. He was 17 when they sold him into slavery. 17. He is around 40 years old at this time. 40 years old. If my Common Core math is correct, that's 23 years, right? Math is math, right? I don't know how they do it nowadays, but that's 23 years that Joseph has been gone, has been sold, has been in this land that's not his own with people who aren't his own. 23 years since they betrayed him, and they don't recognize him. And we're not even here yet. We're not even at the verse yet because Joseph finally reveals, he plays a couple tricks on them and sees and tests them. And then he sees that they really don't know who he is. So he reveals himself to them, and they fall down and they see their wrong deeds and their evil, and Joseph forgives them. But that's not where this verse comes in, because they don't believe him yet. He forgives them, and they don't believe him yet. And you know why they don't believe him? Because how could they? How could they believe that Joseph would forgive them? Because of what they did to him. All the hardship, all the prison, all the slavery, all the separation from the people he loved. For 23 years, how can this man forgive us? Why does he say he can forgive us? Why does he give us food? Why is he kind to us? Why is he going to help us live and take care of us? There's got to be something else to it, because a man cannot forgive like that. So here's what they come up with. They think, okay, wait a minute. He still loves Dad. He still loves Jacob. And it would kill Jacob for him to see Joseph kill all of his sons out of anger and wrath and vengeance, or to hurt his sons out of all that. So what he's going to do is he's going to wait till Dad dies. He's going to wait up till Jacob dies, and then he's going to pour out his wrath on us. We figured out his plan because there's no possible way he could forgive us. This has got to be his plan, right? And then we're in chapter 50 now. So Joseph's father dies, Jacob dies, and we're in chapter 50, verse 15. We're almost there. We're almost through the context, right? Then we'll start the sermon. But here we are in chapter 50, verse 15, and Joseph finds out his father died, and his brothers are like, we're in big trouble now. We're in big trouble. In verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died, which it doesn't say that he did. They're just trying to get out of trouble. Verse 17, say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. And then this is where this verse comes in. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Man, what an amazing insight that Joseph has on the sovereignty of God. What an amazing insight. He doesn't forgive because he understands that forgiveness is like holding on to bitterness and how much that will hurt. No, he doesn't forgive because, of all these other reasons that we teach about forgiveness. The reason Joseph forgives is because he understands this about the sovereignty of God. That was the key to Joseph's forgiveness. It was the sovereignty of God. God has a great and mighty plan. Think about where we are in the story. If Joseph's brothers had not sold him into slavery, he would not have been brought to Egypt. If Potiphar had not purchased him from the slave traders, he would not have gained the experience he needed to manage people. If he had not been falsely accused and sent to prison, he would not have been the interpreter for the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. If that had not happened, he wouldn't have been summoned by Pharaoh when he had that dream. So in other words, Joseph saw that God had overseen every single detail of his life to lead him to this point and to this moment. And that's why I can forgive. Am I in the place of God? God is in control. And God is in control of everything. Even what you did to me. All right, so PowerPoint's going to start now because we are on the sermon. So okay, good. I just want to make sure we get, because I'd been going a while without it. So the first point is this. Something that we see in the beginning of verse 20. It says, first point is, man is responsible for his sin and accountable before God. See, we're talking about the sovereignty of God, but we cannot let this slip and fail to notice this. As Joseph says, you meant evil against me. You meant evil against me. And his brothers understood that too. We see that he said that to him as well. His brothers say, listen, please forgive our transgression, please forgive our sin, and please forgive our evil. They use 3 different words for sin, for evil. Transgression, our sin, our evil. We realize that we are responsible for our sin. Joseph does not dismiss or excuse the actions of his brothers, saying, wait a minute, listen, you didn't have a choice. For starters, it wasn't really your fault. It was Dad's fault. He started this whole thing by favoring me. I understand, why you guys were so angry, upset. It's okay. It's not your fault. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say it's God's fault. God had this plan. It's his fault. No, Joseph points out and holds them responsible and accountable for their sin. He says, you guys are responsible and accountable for your sin. Joseph didn't pretend or let them pretend that their deeds were not wicked. Joseph's brothers were sinful. Joseph's brothers were sinful. And to go on top of that, it's easy to sit here and say, how dare they? How dare they? How dare they do that? Some of you guys may relate. Some of you guys had siblings growing up that were like that, that were the parent favorite you thought or tattled on you all the time. You may be like, no, I kind of get it. But a lot of us are going, how could you do this? How could you do such evil and such awful, terrible things to your brother? But let us not forget that like Joseph's brothers, we are sinful as well. We are all sinful. Romans 3:9-12 says this, are we better than they? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. We're in the same boat as Joseph's brothers. Difference is, at this point in time, in this story, we're seeing Joseph's brother standing before Joseph, needing the forgiveness of Joseph. See, we're standing before God, needing the forgiveness of God. Joseph is a picture of Christ in this moment. We just got through studying a few series ago. We just got finished studying Jesus in the Old Testament. Joseph is a picture of Jesus, the crimson thread that runs through the Old Testament, because Joseph stands before his brothers and forgives those who betrayed him and sold him, and he uses his power to save his brothers. That's what Christ did for us. That's what Christ did for us and our sin that we were responsible for. Here's the problem. From the beginning of time, we've tried to not be accountable for our sin. We've tried to not be accountable for our sin. Start with Adam and Eve. That woman you gave me, it was her fault. And Eve, that serpent, it was his fault. And we've been pushing blame everywhere. And the blame falls on us. We are accountable for our sin. We're responsible and accountable before God. And we stand before Christ, like Joseph's brother stood before him, and we stand in the forgiveness of Christ and what he did for us on the cross. That's the first point. The second point is this. God is sovereign, in absolute control, answering to nobody, and his plans cannot fail. I know that's long, but I was excited about it. This is completely true. And they all say the exact same thing, but I love seeing it from several different perspectives. It's very redundant, this point too is, but I think it needs to be redundant because that's something I think we need to understand. Because Joseph says, as for you, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God meant it for good. Men act freely, but their plans always fall within God's sovereignty. Man in our own actions sin and make mistakes, and we mess up, and even here mean evil. But it falls under the scope of God's sovereignty. To put it a different way, God is in control of everything, and oops is not in God's vocabulary. God doesn't look at a situation and go, oops, okay, I didn't mean for that to happen. Oh, oops, oh no, what are we going to do now? That is not in God's vocabulary. I love it. I love this quote by R.C. Sproul. When I was getting the sermon ready, and I got to this point, and I was really excited about looking at this part of the verse where God meant it for good. And I remembered a book I read, one of my favorite books, R.C. Sproul, Chosen by God, a while ago. And he said this. He said, for want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. All for the want of a horseshoe nail. Man, what a great quote that is. And I got excited. I put that in my notes, and I quoted R.C. Sproul, and then I went to go look it up to make sure I had it right, and I found out that he quoted Benjamin Franklin. So it wasn't R.C. Sproul's quote. So I had to give him credit up here for you. And then I know it's really good quote. Some of you guys might want to Facebook it or Instagram it or Snapchat it later. So I'll put mine up there too, so you can quote Benjamin Franklin, quoted by R.C. Sproul, quoted by Danny Evans this morning. So write that down. All right, but what does that mean? What does that mean? It means something, if you don't have control of every single little detail, you don't have control over any of it. If a nail on a horseshoe is lost, the kingdom could be lost. And praise the Lord, there are no horseshoe nails that God doesn't know about or is not in control of. God is in control of every single thing. We don't have to worry about the kingdom being lost. If God has not ordained all things, then there are chance events to come that he will have no control over, and that is not true. If it were, how can we have confidence in his promises? How do we know he wins? We wouldn't. But praise God, we do. I used to sing this song, my grandmother's church, West 49th Street Baptist Church in Anniston, Alabama. We used to sing this one. It's an old Southern gospel song, and it goes like, I read the back of the book and we win, right? It's an old Southern gospel. Anybody ever heard of that one? Man, my songs are not doing well today. Oh, Randy heard it. Yeah, I knew he would. I knew Randy would. But I read the back of the book and we win. And he's talking about the Bible. I've read it. We win. Right? That is true. There's no chance. There's no nail that can mess that up. God has done it. It reminds me of a boxer, right? Some people kind of view God as a boxer that sort of, he just rolls with the punch. Evil happens, bad things happen. He's like, whoa, and he just kind of rolls with the punches and counters. He rolls with the punches and counters. Right? Like, oh, I didn't expect that, and then he's got a counter to quick counter that. That is a terrible view of God. We don't serve a God who rolls with the punches. We serve a God who's finished the fight. It's over. He's death, sin, hell, Satan, the grave, all of it is on the mat, down for the count. It's over. We know this. God has orchestrated, he has ordained everything. He has finished the fight. And we can stand strong in his promises. We can stand strong. When he says something in his word, we know it's true. And there is no possibility of it not being true. That's what it means when God is sovereign and he's in control of everything. So, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. This doesn't make sin less sinful or sinners less punishable. It just means when we act, our plans are always within God's sovereignty. But we're still responsible for those. And the last point I want to make here, point 3. It says, but God meant it for good to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. God's plan is good. That's the sweetest part. It wouldn't be sweet if God's plan wasn't good. God's in control of everything, but he's kind of a jerk. That would not be good. But we know he's not. We know he's not. We know that he is good. He's in control of everything, and he's good. And those two things together should excite you as a follower of Christ. Those things, as a Christian, those things should give your heart more joy than anything else in the world. That God's in control of everything, and his plans are good. Now, some of you guys may be going, wait a minute. There's some evil that's been done to me in my life, or that I've seen done that can't possibly be redeemed. You can't possibly say God can intend this for good. The evil, the awful that I've seen, that I've experienced, that maybe I've even done. Well, 2 weeks ago, I believe, we talked about Judas and his betrayal of Christ. That was the single worst act ever committed in the history of mankind. Judas betraying God to his death on the cross. And you know what? How did God use that? We're sitting in here today free from our sin because God used the worst event ever committed by a human to bring about the greatest hope we could ever receive, the greatest joy we could ever receive. So if God can take the worst event and turn it into the most amazing, incredible event, he can take the events in your life that you look at and go, wait a minute, this is too awful, this is too terrible, this is not possible. You don't know what I'm going through right now. This cannot be good. Let me tell you this. This Old Testament story has kind of a New Testament parallel. There's a New Testament promise that goes with this Old Testament story. Look at this, Romans 8:28. What a great verse this is. It says, for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. This is exactly what we're talking about. This is exactly what Joseph understood about God. All those terrible events. This is what Joseph understood about God. He knew that God was going to work it together for good. No matter how terrible and how awful it was in the pit. He knew this. And what Joseph knew is it says in this verse, for those who love God, all things work together for good. So if I have all my notes in my hand right now, how many notes are here? None. Which means all is all. Which means there's not one thing, there's nothing that God does not work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. All things, everything, every single thing. So that thing in your life, you're saying, God can't possibly. He promises us he does. Put your faith and trust and hope in him. And you may say, wait a minute, Danny, you can't look me in the face and tell me what I'm going through is good. There's no way, there's no one possible who could look me in the face and tell me that. Guys, I understand. I just went through the death of my father last year. You can't know, if somebody tried to look me in the face and tell me that was good, I would laugh at them. Because it wasn't. It was hurtful and it was hard. And it was the toughest thing I've ever been through in my life. But this verse doesn't say all things are good. It doesn't say all things are good. Look at what it says. It says all things work together for good. It wasn't good, but God is working it together for good in my life. So you may be going through things in your life, and you're right, they are not good. They're sinful, they're evil, they're terrible, they're hurtful, they're painful, and they are not good. But this is a promise from God in Romans. He will work it together for good. Have faith and trust in him. Whether you see it now or not, I couldn't at the time. But I had faith. I trusted that he would because of his promises. And I know he's in control, and I know that nothing can thwart his promises. So I know that he has and will continue to work it together through good in my life. Because although Joseph's circumstances were unique to him, his perspective of God is one that I aspire to, that we should all aspire to. The God who orchestrated the events of Joseph's life is the same God who sits on the throne and is sovereign over our circumstances and what we're going through. That should give us hope. And we may not always understand what's happening around us, but like Joseph, we can rest confidently in God and his good work and his good plans. Man, what peace that gives me. God reigns over all. He is all powerful, all wise, all present, and he has promised to work all things together for his glory and our good. That overrides all the evil deeds and intentions of wicked men. I love to think about it this way. Even when Satan wins, he loses. Even when Satan wins, even when he gets a foothold somewhere and he's like, yeah, look at this evil that's happened in this person's life. God turns it around and uses it for his plan and his glory and our good, and Satan can't win. I think he thought he won you look at all the things in history where he thought he won, and God turned him around and redeemed him for his glory. You look at Joseph's life. God didn't author that evil. Satan thinks that he's done it. And even when he wins, he loses, because God is in control of everything, and we have nothing to fear. This is why the Bible says, by the way, if God is for us, then who can be against us? Who can be against us? I just said God is all powerful. Remember the notes? If I have all the notes in this hand, how many do I have in this hand? If God has all the power, how much power is left? There is none. We serve an all-powerful God who is in control of everything and works out everything in the life of those who are called according to purpose and love him for their good. I'm going to end with a quote by R.C. Sproul. I kind of had a quote at the beginning by him, so I'm going to end with a quote by him. He says, "We do not live in a world of chance or chaos. It began with a purpose. It is sustained with a purpose, and it has an ultimate purpose. This is my Father's world, and his rule is purposeful. Purposelessness is an impossibility." Man, that's awesome. That gives me hope. Let's pray.